So, hello everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Nicole Lamberson. I was trained as a physician assistant. I am a member of the outreach team for the film Medicating Normal, and I host conversations like this one today. Our guest today is Patrick Hahn. He is a freelance writer and independent scholar with a longstanding interest in iatrogenic harm and the medicalization of everyday life. He has three books. His first book, Madness and Genetic Determinism, is Mental Illness in Our Genes. His second book is Prescription for Sorrow, Antidepressants, Suicide, and Violence. And then his latest book, his third book, Obedience Pills, ADHD, and the Medicalization of Childhood, is the one that we're going to talk about today. This is the book. It describes the harms wrought by the drugs commonly prescribed for something called, quote, ADHD, and the nexus of special interests, which sustains this $20 billion a year industry, whose influence is now spreading from the United States to the entire globe. Our moderator for the talk today will put the links to his books in the comments section if you're interested in checking those out or reading them. And lastly, Dr. Hahn is an affiliate professor of biology at Loyola University, Maryland. So hello, Dr. Hahn, welcome. Thanks so much for joining us today. And I guess to get started, did I leave anything out of your introduction that you wanted to mention or?
Nope, sounds good to me.
Okay, great. So I just wanted to say that I read the book and I think it's great. It contains a lot of case histories and expert testimonies, but mostly to a really comprehensive and interesting history of ADHD. So if anybody is interested in all of those things, definitely get a copy. And I showed the book. I was reading it by the pool and posted a picture of it, and somebody said they really liked the graphic that you used here. So, well, to start, I guess I just want to ask, what inspired you to begin writing about iatrogenic harm and the medicalization of everyday life, especially as it relates to psychiatry? And maybe for people who don't know what iatrogenic means, you can explain.
Yeah, iatrogenic literally means brought about by a healer. And it could mean any effect due to medicine, but almost always when it's used, it refers to harmful effects.
Okay.
Yes, I'd like to mention I'm not a medical doctor, and my degree is not in a relevant field. I was trained as a zoologist. I've never claimed my degree gives me any authority in these matters, but it has given me a perspective, which I think is undervalued. Our bodies, and always remember, our brains are part of our bodies, are the product of over 500 million years of evolution. They are marvelous instruments if they're properly cared for. And I was disturbed by what I see as this worldview of us as these disease-ridden creatures who need massive amounts of medical care to keep us alive from cradle to grave. That just did not sit right with me. And I wanted to write about medical harm, not specifically psychiatry, but if you wish to write about medical harm, psychiatry gives you an endless vein of examples to draw from. And when I began this, I assumed that there was such a thing as mental illness, but it was probably overdiagnosed. I've come to the conclusion that the term mental illness is a semantic mistake, like saying a purple idea or a wise room. You put those two words together, they don't even make any sense. There are no mental illnesses. There are problems with living. Everybody has problems with living. Some people have terrible problems with living, but I don't believe we're helping them by telling them that they suffer from a drug-treatable brain disease. and decades of research, billions of dollars spent on brain imaging studies and genome-wide association studies have not produced a single finding that has benefited a single patient in a clinic anywhere in the world. I'd say it's time to look at other approaches to problems with living. Specifically for ADHD, this term, as you mentioned, it stands for Attention Deficit Hyperactivity Disorder. This was introduced in 1980 by the authors of the third iteration of the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, or DSM-3, which ushered in the new era of biological psychiatry. But there are accounts in the medical literature going all the way back to 1900 or so, which today are said to be accounts of children suffering from ADHD. And if you read these accounts and you ask what is the commonality, it's pretty hard to say, other than these were children whose behavior was judged a problem by somebody. You look at these accounts, the same account can include stubborn and defiant, or stubborn and overly eager to please as symptoms of the same disorder, or excitable and inattentive, or submissive and rebellious. Most often this condition was referred to, this diagnostic category is referred to as hyperactivity. And one of the symptoms of hyperactivity is extreme sluggishness. I mean, this doesn't make any sense. These accounts have a long list of symptoms, sometimes mutually exclusive, all of which intergrade imperceptibly into normality, and which the authors of these accounts generally conceded the child could be expected to outgrow as he got older. The oldest clinical account that's said to be of children suffering from ADHD was published in 1903 by George Still, who was regarded as the founding father of pediatric medicine. And he had 20 case histories of children, 15 boys and 5 girls. And upon reading these accounts, the first thing that's obvious is that these were children with serious problems. This wasn't the kid who fidgets too much or the kid who daydreams too much. These were children who banged their heads, smeared their feces, viciously attacked other children and adults, acted out sexually, set fires, so on and so forth. And another thing that's obvious upon reading this account is that these seriously disturbed children. He didn't call this hyperactivity or ADHD, by the way. He called it a lack of moral control. And another thing these children had in common is that these seriously disturbed children came from seriously disturbed families that were rife with tales of abuse, abandonment, alcoholism, neglect. One of these children's one of the fathers of one of these children had murdered the child's mother. And Dr. Still gave no consideration at all to the possibility that these children's difficulties could lie in their disturbed environments. He flipped it around and he said that this was proof of the hereditary nature of this profession. And since then, the definition of this diagnostic category has expanded to the point where any doctor could give any child a diagnosis of ADHD if he wants to.
So that's my next question again. I guess, what does it take to get an ADHD diagnosis these days? I mean, you say in the book, the criteria for diagnosis is vague and subjective. So Do we have any biomarkers, genetics, neuroimaging studies? Yeah.
Absolutely not. No biomarkers, and they've spent billions of dollars looking and generated untold petabytes of data. They cannot tell the brain of a child who is said to have ADHD from the brain of a child who is said to be neurotypical. The diagnosis is made on the basis of a symptom checklist. So there's a list of, I believe it's 9 symptoms for hyperactivity, 9 symptoms for inattention. So you need 6 of the 9 for a diagnosis of ADHD hyperactive type, 6 of the other 9 for ADHD inattentive type, and 6 from both checklists. So there's no overlap between the 2 checklists. So 2 children could have a diagnosis of ADHD and have no symptoms at all in common. And they're just hopelessly vague and context dependent. We'll take a look at just one. Unable to play or attend to leisure activities quietly. Guess what? Children do not play quietly. Mm-hmm. They chatter incessantly. They yell and scream and laugh. That's part of being a kid. Mm-hmm. And, you have to wonder, did these people who made these checklists, did they ever have children, or even wonder if they ever were children? And finally, if all else fails, there's the diagnosis of ADHD NOS, which means not otherwise specified, which doesn't have to meet even these vague criteria. So the upshot is, if a clinician wants to give a child a diagnosis of ADHD, he can do so.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And you talk in the book how there's actually like incentive for being diagnosed with ADHD. Can you explain?
Yeah, the law has created a perverse set of incentives that can make an ADHD label seem like an attractive option to some parents. And I have to say, the term mentally ill has expanded to the point where I don't think I know anybody who could not get a diagnosis of mental illness. I mean, when I was a boy, I understood the term mentally ill to mean paranoia, hallucinations, delusions, mania. And whether or not you think any or all of these are the result of a drug-treatable disease, I don't. But there's no denying that the people with the label mentally ill had serious problems. And nobody wanted to be considered mentally ill. And that's flipped around. The law has created a perverse set of incentives for parents, which can make seem getting this label an attractive option. The children may get extra time on tests, extra high interest materials. That one always has me shaking my head. Shouldn't they all be getting that? Mm-hmm. Permission to stand up, stretch, walk around in class, yada, yada, yada. And this extends beyond primary school and secondary school. Young adults with this label are now eligible for extra time taking the law school aptitude test, the medical college admissions test. Unfortunately, nobody has figured out a way to give all these ADHD afflicted aspiring doctors extra time when they're working the emergency room and a patient presents with, say, an open skull brain injury or a cardiac arrest. Mm-hmm. And ultimately, it takes time and money and knowledge to work the system this way. which biases this in favor of people who are wealthy, highly educated. An article in the Vanderbilt Law Review referred to this process as affirmative action for the elites.
Mm-hmm.
And ultimately, I don't think the parents are doing the kids a favor this way. I mean, making excuses, cadging special favors, that is not the route to a satisfying life. I mean, the route to a satisfying life is finding the right niche for yourselves, paying attention to what you're good at and what you're not good at. A Dr. Healy, whom I've worked closely with for all three of my books, told me an interesting story.
Mm-hmm.
He had a patient, a young man who was bright, energetic. He had big ideas. He knew how to get people excited about his ideas. And he wanted to become an entrepreneur. Sounds great.
Mm-hmm.
But somehow this young man got into his head the idea that the way to do that was first you had to get a job at a giant corporation and work your way up the ladder. That's not entrepreneurship. That's the opposite of entrepreneurship.
Mm-hmm.
But that's what he thought. So he went to university and studied business, found himself spending most of his time doing spreadsheets, tasks that bored him and failed to inspire him. But he got diagnosis of ADHD, got the drugs, which in the short term, they unquestionably increase your ability to focus on boring tasks. There's no doubt about that. So he managed to get through his degree, and he got a job at a giant corporation. And he found himself doing more spreadsheets.
Mm-hmm.
That's not good. I mean, some of us, this used to be called, Carl Jung wrote about the dichotomy between introverts and extroverts. And both of these were seen as just part of the normal range of human variation. And today, the people who in an older time would have been called introverts now get diagnosed with anxiety or depression. The ones who would have been called extroverts are now diagnosed with ADHD. And these are seen as I said, drug treatable brain diseases and not as strengths. And this is very unfortunate. I mean, it's a cliche to say it takes all kinds to make a world, but very often the reason we have cliches is because they're true.
Mm-hmm. So, we just touched on some of the incentives for ADHD, but have you come across any downsides? I mean, whenever I think of, these so-called mental illness diagnoses, I run into people who regret having been diagnosed because later in life, it can come back to bite you. For example, you're getting a divorce or something, and your ex-husband decides to use your mental illness against you when he's trying to get custody or something like that. So with ADHD, is there anything these kids, later in life have sort of taken away from them because they're diagnosed?
Well, I don't doubt that. I mean, you're giving kids exactly the wrong message. I mean, life is all about developing the internal and external resources to cope with adversity.
Mm-hmm.
And, if becoming a better person is a matter of taking the right pills, then everything I think I know about being human must be wrong. But that can't possibly be true.
Mm-hmm.
If becoming a better person were a matter of taking the right pills, we wouldn't be sitting here discussing this. We'd all be taking the pills.
Mm-hmm.
There's no way you could keep something like that a secret. And I'd like to refer you to the multimodal, what MTA study I forget what that stands for, just a moment. Multimodal, well, never mind. There must be a pill I can take for that. But anyway,
Okay.
yeah, this was the far and away the largest and the longest study of ADHD meds.
Mhm.
This was run by eminently credentialed experts, probably all of whom believed in the disease model of ADHD. And it involved 600 children, and they were randomly assigned to 4 categories: medication alone, medication plus therapy, therapy alone, and usual community care.
Mhm.
And the randomization phase lasted for 14 months, at which point they were all released to usual community care.
Mhm.
And they followed up these kids for 16 years. Well, by that time, they weren't kids anymore, they were in their 20s. And the only long-term effect they were able to document, the only one, there were 24 outcome variables and no difference between
Wow.
any of the treatment groups for any of 24 outcome variables. The only long-term effect they were able to document, remember, this is their study, not mine. The only long-term effect they were able to document was the drug stunted the kids' growth. That was the only long-term effect they found. And now they're finding that amphetamine uh, and can cause Parkinson's disease years down the road. And so the kids who swallow these pills today may be dealing with the ill effects decades from now.
Yeah.
And in a
So,
small minority of users, not all of them, but a substantial number, it causes mania and paranoia and violence. And I've got some heartbreaking case histories in the book of children whose lives were just destroyed by, or children or young adults whose lives were destroyed by these drugs. I talked about Rebecca Riley.
Mhm.
At the age of 2, she was diagnosed with ADHD and given clonidine.
Mhm.
At the age of 3, she was diagnosed with bipolar disorder. And at the age of 4, she was dead from the clonidine, killed her. And you read the police report. Uh, I couldn't find an atom of evidence that there was anything wrong with this tot,
Mhm.
except she had the misfortune to be born to 2 parents who were probably unfit to take care of a goldfish, let alone a tiny, helpless human being, let alone 3 of them.
Yeah.
This family was just a cesspit of dysfunction. And, they didn't want therapy, they didn't want counseling, just give us the drugs.
Mhm.
And the parents had gotten, oh, this is another, you talked about incentives. Children who get this label, the family is eligible for SSI payments.
Mhm.
And they had gotten SSI payments for their 2 older children. They tried to get them for Rebecca, and they were rebuffed. And so, did the parents? Did this play a role in this neglect that caused her death? It's hard to prove, but you have to wonder.
Yeah. Well, I think, incentives are one thing, and there's probably some families that, like you describe, highly dysfunctional, trying to buck the system, that kind of thing. But I think a lot of parents and stuff truly are bought into this, and they think that they're helping their children and they're doing the right thing. And uh, so why do you think, like, it seems, especially right now in this day and age, parents are more overprotective than ever, and yet they're buying into this diagnosis and giving their children these highly dangerous medications. So why do you think parents are going down this path and so easily believing this diagnosis?
Yeah, I think there's a couple of reasons. Our sense of national identity and unity has been eroded just to an incredible degree since I was young. It's now every man and woman and boy and girl for himself or herself. And so I'm not surprised to see some people seek an edge for themselves or for their children by means of a label and a pill. And the other thing is this, I'm 61 years old. My formative years were the 70s and the late 60s. And that was an era that celebrated the whistleblower, one who spoke truth to power. People like Woodward and Bernstein, Frank Serpico, Rachel Carson, just ordinary men and women who spoke truth to power. And today, many of the people, I can't say all of them, many of the people who style themselves as progressive, their guiding principle just seems to be gullibility and willingness to be led, which is exemplified in that vile phrase, you must not do your own research when it comes to science. And the people who make that argument are sawing off the branch they're sitting on. Whether we're talking about psych meds or COVID vaccines or early treatment for COVID. I mean, if we're all too ignorant to understand the medical literature, then that would mean we have no way of knowing whether they're telling the truth or lying when they say any given intervention is safe and effective or not safe and effective. And therefore, we have no more reason to believe them than we have to accept the commands of an astrologer or a fortune teller. I really have no idea how those guys come to the conclusions they do. Does that mean I have to believe whatever they say?
Right.
Yeah. And the media is heavily dependent. I discussed in the book, heavily dependent on drug company advertising now. We're the only country besides New Zealand that allows direct to consumer advertising. And back in the 90s, the daytime talk shows did some pretty hard-hitting pieces about the harmful effects of psychiatric medicines, psychiatric drugs. And Dr. Bregan was a frequent guest on those shows. And all that stopped in 1997. That was the same year that they allowed direct to consumer advertising. And there's a point that never gets mentioned that I'd like to mention now.
Sure.
Drug company money means our money, my money, your money. 14% of prescription drug costs are paid for out of pocket. That means the other 86% are paid for by the rest of us. We're paying with our taxes, we're paying with our insurance premiums, we're paying in higher prices. And if you're one of America's tens of millions of benefits ineligible employees who are often doing the same work as their benefits eligible colleagues for a fraction of their salary and no benefits, you're paying with your surplus labor. So drug company money means our money. So the drug companies take our, and the drug companies take our money because of this fiction that science has shown these drugs to be safe and effective. But the science is manufactured by the same drug companies that using our money, and they take more of our money to fund expert panels to decide who should take the drugs. And they take more of our money to pay the key opinion leaders to tout their wares at professional meetings. And they take more of our money and use it to fund continuing education courses for physicians. And they also take more of our money and use it to fund direct to consumer advertising. And how can this not result in our being inundated with useless and dangerous drugs? Yeah, I talked a little bit about some of those direct to consumer advertisements in my book.
Mhm.
And there was one where they show a child and he's taking his pill and then hangs his coat up on a hook. A pill to make your kid hang up his coat? Seriously? Is that what parents want? And it's a measure of how besieged some parents feel today that the answer is probably yes. I'm not blaming the parents. As I said, I grew up in the 70s and the late 60s. I do not remember my childhood
Mhm.
as terribly harsh and punitive. In fact, I remember it as quite pleasant.
Mhm.
And it was because grown-ups were in charge. And that was just a fact. Everything else had to be worked around. Everybody knew it. Even the juvenile delinquents knew it.
Mhm.
They would break the rules when grown-ups weren't looking,
Mhm.
but even they wouldn't have dreamed of directly challenging grown-up authority. And that's gone now. And it does. I don't blame a drowning man for clutching at straws, and I don't blame parents for seeking help in the form of a label and a pill. But I
Yeah.
don't believe that's going to help.
Yeah. So let's talk a little bit more about the medications. What drugs are typically used to treat ADHD? And in your research for this book, what did you find about the harms of long-term medications? And, what about like withdrawal syndromes?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Uh, the first drug used to treat a hyperactivity was amphetamine.
Mhm.
And the man who first used that drug was a fellow named um, let me look at this. Sorry about that.
Oh, that's okay.
Yeah, Charles Bradley. Yeah, and he was working at the Bradley Home for disturbed children, which, by the way, was named after a distant relative of his.
Mhm.
And so he was the first to prescribe amphetamine for troubled children. And every account of the diagnostic category that came to be known as ADHD uh, tells the story of Charles Bradley and his work on giving amphetamine to troubled children. But what is usually glossed over or never mentioned at all is why he started giving this drug to kids in the first place.
Mhm.
Charles Bradley was using a technique called pneumoencephalography to study the brains of these children. So what that means is the child would be strapped into a rotating chair, and after enduring a painful lumbar puncture, the child would they would inject air into the spinal canal to displace. They would withdraw a quantity of cerebrospinal fluid and leave a bubble of air in its place.
Mhm.
And then the child in this rotating chair would be rotated into a series of positions to displace the cerebrospinal fluid with air to allow a better contrast for taking x-rays. And this procedure often left the children with severe headaches, vertigo, nausea, etc. It could take weeks for the normal amount of cerebrospinal fluid to be generated. And Charles Bradley became concerned about the misery that this procedure was inflicting on the children.
Mhm.
Not concerned enough to stop doing it, but concerned somewhat nonetheless.
Yeah.
And so he gave amphetamine. This drug had just been released 5 years before. He gave amphetamine to these children. Actually, didn't do anything for their headaches, but it made the children more subdued, more able to focus on boring tasks. In other words, it created the kind of changes that an exhausted parent or a harassed school teacher might regard as improvements. And of course, we know amphetamine causes mania, paranoia, violence. My gosh, back in the 60s, even the hippies knew speed kills. And this is the same drug they give to millions of children, not a similar drug, the same drug. So about 60% of them get amphetamine. The other 40% get Ritalin, which is a drug that's similar to amphetamine, does more or less the same thing to the brain. Mm-hmm. Oh, and by the way, getting back to Dr. Bradley, what about his brain imaging studies? These were the first brain imaging studies of troubled children. What did this add to our knowledge? Nothing. Yielded no findings of any clinical benefit whatsoever.
You talk about in the book how, you were just talking about stimulants causing mania and that sort of thing. What is that relation to the bipolar diagnosis then?
Yeah, that's a good question. Bipolar disorder was Robert Whitaker first pointed this out in his book, Mad in America. Mm-hmm. It was extremely rare in adults and unheard of in children. And then we began dosing large numbers of adults with stimulants and antidepressants. And lo and behold, the rates of bipolar diagnosis in this group skyrocketed. Then the experiment was repeated with children. We began dosing large numbers of children with stimulants and antidepressants. And again, the rate of bipolar disorder, which was unheard of in children, again skyrocketed. And they acknowledge all this in the medical literature. And they claim, bizarrely, that these drugs are unmasking a pre-existing disorder. And if you think anyone with two adjacent brain cells would ask, wouldn't it be better to leave it masked?
Yeah. So somebody from the audience wants to know, they said, I see a trend of adults eagerly seeking an ADHD diagnosis and identifying as having ADHD. So this used to be solely a childhood disease. And now how did it become one of adulthood as well?
Yeah, this was an initiative that began with Paul Wender, who was one of the biggest proponents of drugging children back in the 70s. And then he began advocating for extending this to adults. And again, anybody can take the doyen, Wender has gone on to his reward. The doyen of adult ADHD today is a fellow named Ned Hollowell. And you read his book, and he himself identifies as having ADHD, although since he graduated from medical school, it's not obvious in what sense he suffers from a deficit of attention, but never mind that for now. And he's going on and on about the symptoms of adult ADHD, cocaine abuse, addiction to pornography, consumption of pornography, addiction to crossword puzzles. Where is he getting this stuff from? He's just making it up as he goes along. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and anybody, child or adult, can take a stimulant drug and very likely will experience in the short term an increase in concentration, an ability to focus on boring tasks, and if he is so inclined, can attribute all of his life's failures to his doctor's failure to diagnose his adult ADHD. And again, the longest term study they found was done by Joseph Biederman and his associates. I've got a whole subchapter on Biederman. And they studied adult ADHD, and they found no long-term benefits, even 6 months out, of drugging adults for something called ADHD. And the thing is, I mean, we've all known people with advanced degrees in their 30s or maybe even beyond, working lost and unmoored, working odd jobs, and feeling in their bones that they were meant for something better. Maybe all these people need to do is get diagnosed and drugged for their ADHD. Or maybe they need to realize that they still have some lessons to learn right where they are.
Right.
Going on to bigger and better things. Most of us are works in progress. Most of us suffer from one or more of the character defects that fall under the rubric of adult ADHD. And it's not clear why we can't work on these character defects instead of attributing them to some mythical disease entity, the existence of which has never been demonstrated.
Yeah. So another person is commenting, although there are exceptions, many people report being helped by these medications. It might take years for it all to go bad, if it ever does. Should we deny people the help they perceive they get from the medications? Who are we to argue with what they perceive has been beneficial?
I tend to think that adults should be allowed to take any drug they want. I don't even get into the debate anymore about whether this drug or that drug should be legal or illegal. I no longer even see it as the most important issue. To me, the most important issue is people should know the harms of the drugs they're taking.
Yeah.
Whether we're talking about Prozac or Paxil or pot. And none of these drugs are harmless. So I tend to think that adults should be allowed to take whatever drug they want. If it works for you, fine, I'm happy for you. I don't think any child should be given these drugs. Far better, there are hundreds of reasons why any given child might have problems with inattention or hyperactivity. Far better to identify the source of that child's distress and try to solve it than to attribute that child's problems to some mythical disease entity, and as of which I said, the existence of which has never been demonstrated.
Yeah. And it goes beyond too, just, allowing or denying somebody a medication that they perceive benefits them, right? Because this isn't free. This diagnosis alone costs how much money and, taxpayer dollars and that kind of thing, that where people should be allowed to sort of have an opinion on, aside from just, should you be allowed to take a medication you want or not? What is the cost of ADHD?
Yeah, we spend $20 billion on ADHD drugs. That's several times as much as the rest of the world combined. For that kind of outlay, we could pay the mid-career salaries of an extra 350,000 teachers or 800,000 teachers' aides. I say, let's do that. We've got, the drug companies have on their side a multi-billion-dollar propaganda machine that Stalin probably would have envied. And they spent billions of dollars, decades of research. They haven't been able to demonstrate any long-term effects of these drugs. It's very hard to prove a negative. I can't prove that no child has ever benefited from taking these drugs, but I say we need to protect the children from the drug companies. I don't think any child should be given these drugs.
Yeah.
Oh, there's another thing, that getting the label may result in benefits to the child. I mean, the child is, he might get counseling, even just the regular doctor's visits. You're getting something that looks like care and concern for children from seriously disturbed families. That may be better than nothing, but no, I don't believe any child should be given these drugs.
Yeah. You mentioned briefly just a minute ago about our spending is more than other countries. I've heard just in conversations about ADHD, people saying, oh, well, they don't have ADHD in France. They don't even diagnose it. Is that true? And like, what are other countries doing?
Well, that's, yeah, they do have ADHD in France. Of course, it's beyond the scope of this work to write a comprehensive history of the ADHD diagnosis in every country where it's used.
Right.
But I looked at 3 countries. Canada, which has embraced the disease model of ADHD almost as enthusiastically as the United States. Ghana, in which the disease model has barely begun to penetrate. And the third was France, where the disease model has encountered substantial resistance, but it's still penetrated to an extent. So French children do get diagnosed and drugged for ADHD, but maybe about 5% of the rate as in the United States.
Wow. Okay. That's interesting. So it's like you think if it is a real thing, that it would be real everywhere, right? Not just, oh, there's only, 5% of what we're doing here in the United States over in France. Why isn't anyone explaining that significant difference in numbers? So what about alternative treatments? In the book, you talked about something called Monarch ETNS.
Oh my God, yeah, these kiddie electroshock machines. So their parents, they're supposed to hook this child up to this machine that delivers low voltage electric shocks to the child's forebrain all night long. Right. I talked about the trial. The FDA doesn't even require any trials for the approval of medical devices. And you wonder what is going to be the long-term effect of telling the child that their brains are so defective they require this complex ersatz medical ritual night after night.
Well, even just medications too, that is sort of sending the message that something is wrong with you. You need fixing, diagnosis, medication, brain,
yeah,
ETNS or whatever it's called. Yeah.
Yeah, I talked about the video that Monarch produced for the users of this device, and they show this 11-step procedure for setting up the device every night. And they show this child serenely obedient to his mother as she goes through this complex procedure. And you wonder how any kid that docile and submissive could have ever gotten the ADHD label in the first place. I find that horrendous. I spoke with Dr. Bregan about that. He had some choice words about that.
Yeah, I wonder how similar it is to the transcranial magnetic stimulation. Have you heard of that one?
I've heard of it. I haven't looked into it.
Okay. Yeah. It'll be, maybe I'll go look later and see, if they're related to each other in some way or something like that.
But at some point, it's hard to prove a negative. I mean, I can't prove Bigfoot does not exist, but I'd say at this point it's pretty unlikely. And I'd say it's about equally unlikely that these conditions called mental illnesses are caused by defective brains. They've spent billions of dollars looking for it, and they haven't found it. And I say it's time to try a new approach. I mean, we know the conditions that are needed for children to thrive,
Mhm.
not rocket science.
Yeah.
First of all, children need to be sheltered and protected from harm. They need to be fed wholesome foods in appropriate quantities. They need clear boundaries, consistent discipline, lots and lots of outdoor free playtime every day.
Mhm.
Show me a child who is provided with these things who fails to thrive.
Yeah. That was some of the things done in the link study that you talked about in
Oh, yeah.
Texas and Oklahoma, correct?
Yes, that was like a breath of fresh air. I talked to the lady who initiated that. Her name is Deborah Rhea. She was a professor of physical education. Yeah, it's very simple. They give the children, kindergarten through grade 3, uh, an hour of outdoor, unstructured outdoor free playtime every day
Mhm.
in 15-minute increments. The children never spend more than an hour in the classroom without a break. And they found the incidence of antisocial behaviors went down, children's body mass went down, the incidence of positive social behaviors, clapping, hopping, cheering, smiling, laughing, went up. Imagine that. Children
It,
who were allowed to play outdoors, laugh, and smile more.
yeah. It
Oh,
all
what
just
about
seems
the
so,
standardized test scores?
yeah,
They went up too. They didn't go up
common
by a
sense.
lot, but they went up. They
Mm.
didn't go down. You know, people have this idea that sticking the kids' noses in the material all day long will ensure learning, and I don't think that's working.
Yeah. So before we go, I'm just curious, when you told me your education history, what do you think about like these studies with the psychiatric drugs getting into the water and how the fish and animals are?
Yeah, I've seen those. There's our nation's rivers have not just measurable amounts of Prozac,
Mhm.
but enough to alter the behavior of the fish living in the water.
Yeah.
And the same with anti-anxiety drugs. I mean, why wasn't this front page headline news?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a
And from what I've read, it didn't alter the fish's behavior in any positive way. Like it's disrupting the whole way that, they normally function, which is important for, reproduction and migration and all these other things that, the scientists were looking at. But yeah. Um, so I guess lastly, is there anything that we didn't touch on that you want to add before we close?
Well, I think we had a pretty good discussion. Yeah, I have a chapter, ADHD in the time of COVID,
Mm-hmm.
and they talk about how the pandemic restrictions have led to an increase in troubled behavior in children and an increase in ADHD diagnosis. I read this, I thought to myself, well, my God, you've just said it. This is not an inherited brain disease.
Mm-hmm.
This is children's perfectly understandable reactions to abnormal stress and trauma.
Yeah.
And we ought to address that instead of drugging the kids.
Mm-hmm. At Loyola, where you teach, do you have any opportunity to talk about any of these topics, or do you teach, completely different subject matter?
Yeah, I teach invertebrate zoology. I taught a 1 month online course in science writing for MIT. I'm hoping to do that again. And hopefully get the students, get more people to learn to look at scientific communication skeptically and
Yeah.
make their own decisions and do their own research.
Yeah, that's important. I think inspiring young people to think critically and to be their own best health advocate. I wish, looking back, that I would have had some kind of, education on that, not just, I think so many people just blindly go to the doctor and they think that they are the authority in the white coat and they just do whatever they're told without researching or learning anything about the drugs or the diagnosis or the history, which you've detailed so much in this book. So thank you for writing it. And also you have a blog over at Mad in America, correct?
Yes, that's correct.
Okay.
Yep.
Before we close, do you want to direct anybody to where they can find you or follow any of your work?
Well, you can go onto my Amazon author page, and that also has a link to my blog. So yeah, I'd be delighted if I've inspired anyone and anyone desire to learn more about these matters to take charge of their own health.
Okay. Awesome. Well, we'll also put the links in the comments if you're watching on Facebook and in the description if you're watching on YouTube. So thank you so much, everyone, for joining us today for this discussion. If you have not yet seen Medicating Normal, please go to our website at medicatingnormal.com/watch for the many ways you can view it. We just got up on Apple TV this week, and more platforms for viewing are coming soon. You can also buy the film on DVD if you're in the United States and Puerto Rico. As always, check the events tab on our Facebook page for more upcoming interviews like this one. And if you'd like to support our outreach efforts to bring the film and more conversations like these to communities worldwide, you can make a donation at medicatingnormal.com/donate. So thank you again, Dr. Hahn, for joining us, and keep up the good work. And again, this is his book, Obedience Pills. You can get yourself a copy. It's very interesting if you're interested in ADHD and how it came to be. So take care, everybody. It was nice meeting you, Dr. Hahn. Thank you. Bye.